makers of ram-tough Dodge trucks and cars that will...
Freshen the fridge and freezer with Arm & Hammer Pure Baking Soda.
You saw those Godfather movies. The ones with the dapper guys with the long coats, with the carnation in the lapel and the gun in the inside pocket. Well, that's the image that comes to our minds when we hear stories about the mob. And is it really like that? Meet Lou. Lou knows the ins and outs of the Mafia. Why? His father and his uncle were an instrumental part of it. By the time Lou was 12 years old, he was aware that his father killed people for a living. Did you not have to tell your father? First of all, why do you want to be a cop?
Couldn't. My father was dead before I turned out to be a cop. He would never. He hated cops with a passion.
Dad passed on. Why did you want to be a cop?
I was a good kid. I never was in trouble. I played football for Erasmus Hall. I had scholarship offers.
And you became a cop, and you're too modest to say you were the 10th best decorated cop in the NYPD. That's New York Police Department.
Right.
I had law enforcement on my payroll. I had them looking after the cops.
Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa are accused of being hitmen for the mob.
Tommy walked into my office one day and said, I think I've got a little piece of information about Caracappa and Eppolito. And I knew exactly who he was talking about because, you know, I've been in law enforcement for a very long time. And it was always talked about among people in law enforcement that Eppolito particularly was somehow mobbed up, as we say. And the surprise to most people was that Caracappa, who was his partner off and on during the time he was on the police force, was involved as well. But we all knew that they had been suspected of being somehow connected to the Mafia. And he came in, and particularly with regard to one homicide that they were involved with, said to me that he had gotten a new piece of information that he thought might push the investigation along and might allow us to not reopen, but open an investigation that had been long dormant. You know, dormant in the sense that for years people had talked about it but never done anything about it. And the piece of information was a phone call that he received from the mother of one of the victims in the case, a fellow by the name of Jimmy Heidel. Jimmy Heidel was a kind of wannabe, a guy who hung around mob circles and was not a made man by any sort. But he was the kind of guy who was vicious and had a very bad temper and did a lot of things on behalf of the mob that he got paid for. Jimmy disappeared one afternoon, never to be seen again. And his mom always felt that he had been either kidnapped or killed right on the spot wherever he was, and it was an open case and had been an open case for a long time. Jimmy's mom, Betty Heidel, knew Tommy because her second son, Frankie Heidel, was also kind of a wannabe, the guy who had been hanging around the mob for a very long time. And he had become an informant, however, and he had been killed as well. So Jimmy was killed first, Frankie was killed second. It was the second homicide, the Frankie Heidel homicide, that put Tommy and the Heidel mom together. And Tommy solved the Frankie Heidel homicide. At least solved it to the point of knowing who did it, not necessarily enough to bring him to justice. But he became very close with Betty Heidel. And in a phone conversation, just as a result of Tommy calling her and asking her how she was doing, she said, you know, there's been something that I'd like to talk to you about that I hadn't told you in a very, very long time. In fact, I never told anybody, certainly not you, and it's been a long time, is what I should have said. And it's about Jimmy Heidel. And she told him a story about how on the day of Jimmy's disappearance, that her son Frankie was in Jimmy's car, and that two detectives came by and grabbed him, pulled him out of the car, and thinking he was Jimmy Hidell, rousted him, told him to come with us, and then he finally talked his way out and said, "I'm not Jimmy, I'm Frankie," and they let him go. And he went back to his mom, told her the story. She went out in her car looking for these guys, wondering why they were looking for Jimmy. And she confronted the two of them, and they basically, fluffed her off and said it's police business. And they were in a car that to her was a police car. It was an unmarked, sedan at the time that was used by the cops, and she just kind of went home and let it go. Her son never came back, and she always remembered that day. And what got in her mind that these people may have had something to do with the fact that her son disappeared was that she saw Louis Eppolito some years later on the Sally Jesse Raphael talk show that was on in the mornings here in New York on a daily basis. And he had written a book called Mafia Cop about his career in the police department, and the fact that his family was all mafia people, and how the two things kind of meshed and in some cases didn't mesh. And he was promoting the book, and she saw him, and she recognized him from the confrontation she had on the street in Staten Island, which is where she lived and where they were looking for Jimmy. And she bought the book, and she opened up the book to the section of pictures that was in there, and she saw the second cop, Caracappa, and she realized that she started to put two and two together and realized that there must be some connection between this and her son's death. She kept it quiet for a very long time, thinking that it was not important, but she did tell the FBI about it right then, but she kept it quiet from Tommy and everyone else. The FBI did nothing about it, and when Tommy got that piece of information, he came to me and asked me if I thought that that was enough to open up an investigation into Jimmy Hidell's death. And when I heard it, I was very excited, and we began to work on it. And I put together a little task force. At that time, it was myself, Tommy, and our chief investigator, whose name is Joe Ponzi, chief investigator at the DA's office, and we began to look at this case. One of the other murders that we ultimately uncovered as a result of beginning the investigation with the Jimmy Hidell murder was murder of a mobster named Eddie Leno. And the connection, I should tell you that there is a connection between Hidell and Leno, in that the person who killed Jimmy Hidell and who ordered the killing of Eddie Leno and who was paying Caracappa and Eppolito was a mobster in the Lucchese family named Gaspipe Casso. And Casso, several months before, had an attempt made on his life. And the hit team, so to speak, was made up of Jimmy Hidell, Eddie Leno, and two other people. So the murders of Hidell and Leno by Caracappa and Eppolito, and I say murders because they were charged with both of them, even though they pulled the trigger only on one, were at the behest of Gaspipe because he wanted, obviously, revenge for the shooting of himself. So what they did with Leno was they knew that he had frequented certain social clubs in South Brooklyn on a particular evening, and they waited along the Bell Parkway where they knew that he was going to ultimately get off at an exit where the social club was located. And they were in an unmarked car again. And I should tell you about the unmarked car, because the unmarked car was not a police car. Yeah. It looked like a police car. It was a car that Gaspipe had given these guys to do this kind of thing, to make it look as if they're cops, to make people or fool people that they needed to fool, to get them to pull over, just as they did with Leno. So they pulled Leno over to the side of the road on the, I guess it's the service road of the Bell Parkway in Brooklyn. And he obviously felt that he was being pulled over by cops, and in fact he was. He didn't know that they were bad cops. And they walked over to the car, and they used his cousin's name, not Eddie. And he realized at that point, oh, you don't want me, you want someone else. And it was done, in my opinion, to kind of catch him off guard, to kind of let his guard down, which is what exactly happened. And one of them said something about what's on the floor of the car, and Eddie leaned over to see, and Caracappa took out his gun and shot him in the car. Shot him a couple of times, and then they walked away. It's despicable. I mean, they use the trust that the public placed in them, and the trust that comes along with that uniform and with that badge, and betrayed the trust. I mean, there's no question about it. Caracappa and Eppolito did pick up Jimmy Heidel as if he was going to be brought into a precinct. They handcuffed him, put him in the police car. Only after they took him to a location where he was transferred to the trunk did they obviously, did he probably get the idea, or I'm sure he got the idea at that point, that he wasn't going to any police station, and they put him in the trunk and then delivered him to the person who ultimately killed him.